Hello, everybody, to our annual blessing of the animals at Congregation Tifereth Israel and beyond. And of course, this idea of blessing of the animals started with Saint Assisi, who
Francis.
Francis of Assisi, who was a lover of animals. But, in our tradition, King Solomon was considered wise, not because he was able to speak to people, but because he was able to speak to animals. So we have that tradition, of course, with living with animals, and we'll look at it today. But before we start with that, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for today, Rabbi Laura Duhan-Kaplan. She's the author of Mouth of the Donkey, and we can show the book right here. Excellent book, I must say, and looking forward to the conversation. Reimagining Biblical Animals. She's the director of interreligious studies and professor of Jewish studies at Vancouver School of Theology, and Rabbi Emerita of Or Shalom Synagogue. She lives in Vancouver, Canada, with her husband and young adult children, and a changing array of companion animals. So welcome, Rabbi Kaplan. And I'd like to introduce the topic today of the blessing of the animals, and then we'll do the blessing themselves. So, we tend to feel like we're masters of the animals, but the creation reminds us, the story of creation reminds us that we were created last. In order to remember that, that we're not their masters, we are their shepherds. We live with them. The hierarchy is not that we're above them, but we live with them. And we see that when we don't take care of the environment and the animals, eventually we harm ourselves, physically and spiritually, of course. So, of course, the story of creation tells us a lot about the animals, and we'll get to the blessing that God blessed the animals. We see in Noah, of course, that Noah had to save the animals. So it wasn't just humanity that was saved. Then, of course, their midrashim and the story of Egypt, the leaving Egypt, it says that dogs did not bark. They did not, in a sense, when the Israelites were fleeing, they were quiet and did not alert the Egyptians. And of course, at the end, the story of redemption for us is Vegar Ze'ev im Keves. We say that, right? In Isaiah says at the end, animals will not attack each other either, and a wolf will lie with the sheep. And so from creation to redemption, which is the full story of the Torah, we see that animals accompany us everywhere we go. When we get to the blessing of the animals, we use two main sources for Jewish blessing. And of course, the first thing is what we say in every Shabbat morning, every morning, in Nishmat Kol Chai, we say, the breath of all that lives praises you, Adonai, our God. The force that drives all flesh exalt you, our sovereign, always, transcending space and time. You are God. Without you, we have no one to rescue and redeem us, to save and sustain us, to show us mercy and disaster and in disaster and distress. Ruler of all ages, God of all creatures, endlessly exalted, you guide the world with kindness, its creatures with compassion. Adonai, you neither slumber nor sleep. You steer the sleeping, give voice to the speechless, free the fettered, support the falling, and raise those bowed down. You alone do we acknowledge. So this actually praising God is the praising of all animals. We speak for the animals. So speaking of animals, God bless you.
Here she is.
And Chaya, of course, as animal. She sometimes is a wilde Chaya and sometimes Chaya. And right you go. So we're gonna do the blessing if you want to herd your cat somehow.
Oh, yes, but wait, let me see if I can do this.
Yes. Yeah, okay. She's not a lap dog. I know.
Do you clip her in the winter? Do you clip her
Oh, yeah.
hair at all? I mean, in the summer?
Yeah,
In
the
the
summer, yeah. This is clipped.
Ah,
Yeah, otherwise she'll be like a husky. Here's Jimmy. And Laura, what's your cat's name? What's your
This is
cat?
Toto.
Toto. Toto. Oh, and I see
He doesn't really want to be here.
Neither does Jimmy, so.
and Buster. So we have 2 cats and 2 dogs here.
I could probably find an ant or something like that in my house.
Sit down. Let's see.
So the blessing of the animals, of course, God said to the animals and the creation, and God said, let waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let fowl fly above the earth and the open of heaven. And then and God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that creeped within the waters, swarmed after its kind, and every winged fowl after its kind. And God saw that it was all good. So then we say God blessed them. That's Genesis 1:22. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters and the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth. Amen. And then also we Psalm 104 is a beautiful psalm, saying, it's verse 24. It says, how many are the things you have made, O Lord? You have made them all with wisdom. The earth is full of your creation. In Hebrew, it's marabu. The same idea of pu'uvu. The blessing a lot of times is when things multiply. The word bracha in Hebrew is comprised of 3 root letters that they all multiply the letter before them. So bet multiplies the aleph, the resh multiplies the kuf, and chaf multiplies the yud. So bracha is when you multiply. And then there is the sea, vast of wide, with its creatures beyond number, living things, small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan that you formed to sport with. So the Leviathan, and we see that animals are not just the working animals, and not just, of course, for the earth, but for us to play with. And God has a pet too, and that's the Leviathan. And he plays, and there's a midrash that said, how does God spend his time? Third of the time, he teaches Torah. He works on the Torah. Third of the time, he makes matches. He matches people, and then the third of his time, he plays with the Leviathan. So he has the good balance of work and family and recreation time. So these are the blessing of the animals, and may they be blessed and increased all the time. Roy, you want to, this is Father Roy. Do you want to show Buster, or is he?
He's not wanting to sit on my lap right now.
Okay. Thinking maybe it's gonna be end up in the bath. So, okay, with with that, we've introduced our animals, and we can go now to the presentation of Mouth of the Donkey, and I'm sure we'll get more wider perspective on different animals and their functions in our lives. Rabbi Laura.
I hope so. I'm very glad to be here. And I'm glad that I've got an audience of different species who are here to learn together. And I'm going to share my screen. I just have a couple of slides. But this is not quite correct. There. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. So I'm going to give just a slightly different introduction to myself, but there is a warning. The first slide does have a spider on it. So if you need to not look at a spider, close your eyes for a couple minutes and I will tell you when to open them again. Here we go. This is me. My mother was a dog enthusiast, shall we say. She accidentally acquired her first dog through her children. Let's put it that way. I can tell the longer story later if you're interested in that. And from the day she acquired her first dog, she was never without about 4 or 5 dogs till shortly before she died. So she raised us to pay a lot of attention to the animals in the environment around us. And I will say that some of these are pictures of me with pets, with my own pets. The rabbit, the parrot, the lovebird, the cat. Some of them are friends' pets like the snake. Some of them are at a science museum like the scorpion and the tarantula. And one is a picture I actually managed to snap of me feeding a wild bird on a workshop where we were not supposed to feed the wild birds, but the leader said as long as we didn't identify the photos as coming from a workshop that she was leading, we could take them and share them. So she shall remain nameless. But this is a little bit of the sensibility that I live with. I was raised to pay a lot of attention to the animals in my environment. I see them moving back and forth. I get completely distracted when an animal enters the field. I can entertain myself for hours just looking down at the grass and seeing the very small creatures that come and go. Okay, the spider slide is gone now. I also love the Torah and the Tanakh. So you can imagine that when I read the Torah and the Tanakh, I am also noticing the movement of the animals as they weave in and out of our stories. And there are so many different levels of Torah interpretation. Rabbi Gadi, you guys probably talk about like the Pardes method with the Peshat interpretations of Torah, and then going off into deeper levels of allegory and mysticism and midrash. And a lot of times, people who are really into Torah interpretation, I shouldn't make this generalization, so forgive me, I know it's a wild generalization, but sometimes you have people who are into deep interpretation and they kind of poo-poo the Peshat interpretation. They say, oh, that's just the simple surface meaning of the Torah. But when it comes to understanding and paying attention to the animals in the Torah, the Peshat explanation, the very simple interpretation of what's going on in the story or the teachings in the text, it's very important when it comes to animals. The more you know about the life of an animal that is showing up in a story, the more you understand what kind of a point the writers are trying to make, because they are paying close attention to the animals that are part of their everyday life, companion animals, working animals, wild animals. And they probably had no idea that thousands and thousands of years later, people from around the world in different regions would suddenly be facing these stories about animals that may not be part of our lives. And they assume that we know something about the animals in the stories. But sometimes as readers of Torah, particularly urban readers, we have to recover that information. How do we do it? We can do it partly by reading. I know Anne said earlier on in the beginning that she was also interested in the ways that we can pay very close attention to the different species that share our lives. We can look at their ways of living, their ways of communicating, and we can get a sense from that about what their inner experience might be. And then I like to connect that with a perspective from Kabbalah, which is God's essence and God's consciousness is present in the bodies and the minds and the experience of everything that God created. And thus, the more we understand about the way different species move in the world, the more we can really feel into the presence of God. So that's by way of introduction, general principles. There's a lot of different animals in the Tanakh. There are mythological animals like the talking snake and the talking donkey. There are working animals, donkeys and oxen in particular. There are stories about people who have wild animal companions, usually ravens and crows. There are spiritually inspiring animals like eagles, food animals, which are also animals that are brought to the Mishkan and the temple as offerings. Food animals, sheep, birds, and goats. There are stories about animal messengers sent by God, locusts, and sometimes hornets and wasps. There are threatening wild beasts like bears and lions. And then there are animals that appear as metaphors for different human qualities and behaviors. And we see these a lot in prophetic visions. I'm going to talk in particular about some working animals, that is the donkey, some wild companions, that is the raven or the crow, and one of the spiritually inspiring animals, that is the eagle. Before I go any farther, I know people may ask about dogs and cats. Rabbi Gadi said a little bit about dogs. In the Torah itself, in the 5 books of Moshe, or the Chumash, dogs have a very positive profile, right? As Rabbi Gadi said, there are the dogs that are so spiritually present the night before the Exodus, that they're quiet and silent in the face of what's going on. There is Joshua's close companion, Kalev, right? The dog who is stout of heart and courageous. But once we start getting into the Book of Kings, dogs have a very low profile in the Tanakh, low as in negative. It seems that ancient Israel may have had a large feral dog population, and people viewed dogs as a bit of a nuisance. Dogs are very definitely present, but they have an interesting profile. The only cats present in the Tanakh are the big cats, lions and leopards, and they are scary. And in the mindset of the Tanakh, you do not want one to cross your path.
TV at 1. January 6th there is.
So I will
interrupt?
just put that aside for the dogs and cats. But let's go to the working animals, the wild companions, and the spiritually inspiring animals, because those have great stories. The working animal that gets the most attention in the Tanakh is the donkey. There's the male donkey who's called a chamor, in Hebrew, the female donkey who is the aton. They really appear to play very similar roles in stories in the Tanakh. I know Rabbi Gadi likes wordplay, and chamor is related to the word for homer, which is the clay or the substance out of which we are all shaped. And the donkey is a very substantial animal in the Tanakh. There is a pattern in stories where a donkey appears. And in these stories, a distressed character confronted with a challenging situation. They do not know exactly where they are going. They may not know what they're going to do when they get there. So they saddle up their donkey and they ride. They arrive at their destination, they dismount, and suddenly they know what to do. Great examples of this. I made a list of my favorite. I'll have it in front of me. Great examples of this. Now, there are variations. Avraham, God tells him, offer your son. I'll show you what the place is along the way. Abraham doesn't know where he's going. He saddled up his donkey and he rides. He gets to the place. And when he's there, he finds out that he does not actually have to offer his son in the way he thought. I mentioned Kalev. Kalev has a daughter who wants to ask her father for an inheritance. She doesn't want to do it. She wants her husband to ask her dad for the inheritance, but he doesn't want to do it either. He thinks that she'll have a better chance of completing the mission and getting what they need from her dad, his father-in-law. But Kalev's daughter, Achsa, goes ahead, saddles up her donkey, rides to visit her dad, and what do you know? She finds exactly the right words, and her dad gives the young couple a substantial gift of land. Abigail, one of King David's wives. King David, before he was a king, when he was in his outlaw phase, he and his gang were insulted by Abigail's husband, and they were heading out to do some damage and rough David up a little bit, they thought. Abigail heard about this. She figured she had to do something to stop the violence. She saddled up her donkey. She rode out to meet David. Once she got off the donkey, she knew exactly the right words to say in order to placate David and save her husband and his workers. There are other examples that follow exactly this pattern. The Shunammite woman, the prophet Bilam. There are even some exceptions that prove the rule, like King Shaul, the failed king. We first meet him when he's looking for his father's donkeys, which he never finds. Or the prophet Shimshon, Samson in English, who is clearly, by all accounts, including the one in the book of Judges, he is the worst of all the judges, and he gradually loses his wisdom more and more as the story goes on, until he has nothing left to arm himself with except the bone of a dead donkey. He's got no wisdom left, no wise guide left, right? So the donkey appears in stories as that substantial inner guide. And why not? If you know donkeys, they are loyal, they are helpful, they are thoughtful, they are decisive, they are sensitive to everything that is going on around them. And if it were not for their speed, equine historians say, if it were not for the fact that donkeys are slow and horses are fast, donkeys would have been the military steed of choice because they are much, much calmer when everyone else around them is freaking out. I have other donkey stories, but I want to talk to you about a couple of other animals. The orave, my personal favorite urban wild animal. Biblical Hebrew has only one word for both crows and ravens. It's best translated as corvid, which is the name of the species. The word is orave, and if you're a Hebrew scholar, you'll see it's the exact same letters, the same word as erev, evening, or orave, a mixture, pleasing. And I love the connection of those three words because where I live, crows have colonized the city. There are tens of thousands of crows living in our city, and hundreds of ravens as well. And during the day, the crows fly from their communal roost into the city just at dawn, where they forage and defend and work in their family territories. And every evening, they fly back out to their communal roost. Tens of thousands of crows meeting and greeting and debriefing the day. The communal roost is where they go for dating to find their future mates. It's how cousins link up. It's just a fascinating kind of daily event. And so I imagine that all the different meanings of Orev, Erev, Arov are encapsulated in that moment every evening when the crows fly overhead at that time of day when light and dark are mixing, and their dedicated fans find them so pleasing and so beautiful. It's the time of beauty, it's the time of evening, it's the time of mixing, it's the time of the crow and also the raven. Ravens also have a communal roost, but their communities are much smaller than crow communities. And you can hear my cat is meowing in the background. Give me one moment to quiet the meowing by giving him something that he wants, and I will continue.
So I'll actually interject here while Laura's away. The raven, also orev in Hebrew, is a guarantor. And actually they do live in communities. They kind of guarantee for each other. They are very loyal to each other. And actually the blessing for Israel is that we should be arevim ze lazeh, and we should be mixed with each other, with like erev, but also be each other's guarantors.
I heard that. I love that. It's great. It also fits the stories about the corvids in the Tanakh, because they appear in stories where they help humans through challenging times. The two most famous stories are the ones with Noah and Eliyahu. So Noah is on the ark with all of the animals, and the rains have stopped, and it seems like the waters have subsided and it's going to be safe to come out. But Noach isn't sure, and he sends an Orev out on a reconnaissance mission, and the Torah says that the Orev flies to and fro, until the waters dry up. And after that, Noach sends Yonah, a dove. When I was a kid, I thought that the corvid in this story was some kind of a clown who was no help at all, just flying around back and forth in circles until, Noach got tired of it and had to send a trusty dove. But now that I am a crow and raven lover, and I've had crows nest in our backyard and appeal to us for help, I've got a different picture. In fact, now that actually I was rescued once while hiking by a small flock of ravens, I also have a different picture. I also have heard crows speaking their language with words and syntax. Biologists have documented this. I cannot speak it. I don't know what any of the words mean. They all sound like crow sounds, but they are very clearly arranged, and the crows very clearly speak to one another in a give and take of conversation. You don't hear this language a lot in the city. They're mostly yelling about stuff in the city, but out in a rural area, you can often hear it. So now I understand that what happened in the story was perhaps, this is the mythological universe of the ark, perhaps Noach understood something of the language of the crow or the raven. And in the morning, Noach would open the window and the raven or crow would fly out looking to establish a family territory. Then they'd come back in the evening, give Noach the report of what it was like out there, spend the night in the communal roost that is the ark, and fly back out again the next day to check things out, bring back the report. And it wasn't until the corvid, the Orev, brought back the report that Noach knew it might be safe to send a dove out to forage on the ground, because the Orev does not need to forage on the ground. They can adapt to almost every kind of territory on the planet. That's one story, Noah's trusted scout and perhaps conversation partner. There's also a terrific story where the prophet Eliyahu is running from King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. And he goes down, and Eliyahu goes down and hides in a gorge by a river. And God sends a family of corvids to feed Eliyahu twice a day. I just think that is a great story because I have had the experience of ravens coming and helping me when I was in distress in a remote area, doing the stupidest thing that no one should ever do when they are hiking, which is hiking alone at a very high altitude when I haven't had time to acclimate. But I love the image of the ravens noticing this solitary human, thinking that it's not good to be without a flock to look after you, right? To have nobody who is tied up with you and responsible for you, and bringing him a bit of food twice a day. At a certain point, Eliyahu moves on and goes back to a town and starts being with people. That's a little bit about the corvid. Just a little bit about one more category of animal that you might find in the Tanakh. And this is the nesher. It's translated in English as eagle. The Torah probably has in mind the griffin vulture, which is an animal that is bigger than an eagle, flies much higher than an eagle, and is just majestic beyond belief, at least when it's up in the air. It's kind of awkward looking down on the ground. I am not sure what Nesher means. There are theories that it was an imperial symbol of Ashur, ancient Assyria. I like the connection with the word Osher, happiness, as in Ashrei, happy are those who dwell in your house. The Nesher is better translated in English as eagle than as vulture, though, because even in Shakespeare's times, vulture in English had negative connotations, and eagle in English had positive connotations. So eagle is the right translation to evoke the sense of majesty the Torah has in mind. There are many places in the Tanakh where the eagle is a metaphor for God, right? And why wouldn't it be? It sees everything so clearly from very high up. It soars. It cares deeply for its family. It can be fairly solitary as an adult and live either alone or with one or two other eagles. It can also be very communal and live in the company of hundreds of eagles. It just depends on what their situation requires of them. And they also have beautiful voices. They sound like little glass bells when they sing. So why not? Just a few places where the eagle appears as this gorgeous symbol of God. In Parshat Yitro, right after the Exodus, God says to the Israelites, I carried you on eagle's wings and I brought you to me. In Parshat Ha'azinu, which we recently read, in Moshe's poetry, in the wilderness, God tends to the Israelites just like a mother eagle hovers over her nest. In Psalm 91, the poet says, God shelters us from danger under powerful eagle wings. Divine pinions, it's often translated. And of course, if you like to notice the details of language, the word in Ha'azinu, where God hovers over the nest, Al goz alav yerachef, God will hover over the eaglets, the baby eagles. If you pay attention to the second verse of the Torah in the creation story, you see that the Spirit of God hovers over the waters. Right? Ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim, hovers over the waters, and brings to my mind the image of a mother eagle bringing the world into being, incubating the world into the great diversity of life that we have now. And just a closing photo. It is no wonder that our companion animals inspire us so much, because even thousands and thousands of years ago, and perhaps even more so thousands and thousands of years ago, people looked to animals as wise companions, day-to-day guides, and spiritual inspirations. So I will pause here. That's the prepared part of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Laura. This was beautiful, and I encourage you to read the book and concentrate on so many more beautiful examples that are in it. It really is, there is one example that people don't often pay attention to with our relationship with animals, But as far as I know, there's only one place in the Bible, the whole Bible, that actually talks about animals as a household, like children. There's a lot of relationship and close relationship, but once only in actually in the parable to King David after he sinned with Elisheva, right?
Bathsheba.
Bathsheba. And he said, I'll read to you those verses. So Nathan, the prophet, comes to him and gives him a parable. And he said, and the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said, there were two men in the same city, one rich and one poor. And it says the rich man had very large flocks and herds, but the poor man had only one little ewe lamb that he had brought. He tended to it, and it grew up together with him and his children. It used to share his morsel and bread, drink from his cup, and nestle in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. And that's a good translation because that's in Hebrew too, kevat. So this is the only time, as far as I know, this is a question I wanted to refer to you and your vast research. Have you seen any other example of really mentioning that it was like a family member?
That's a really great question. I cannot, off the top of my head, think of other animals as a close family member, and I'll resist the temptation to veer off into my interpretation of that particular parable. But I think there are other ways of talking about how closely people are intertwined with their animals in the Tanakh, right? Of course, there are the people who are very close with their working animals, like Bilam's donkey saying to him, aren't I your donkey that you've been riding on like since as far back as you can remember?
Right.
As if she's saying, we're a team. We do everything together. And
Yeah, why are you hitting me?
exactly. Why are you hitting me? Why do you think I would steer you wrong, so to speak? So we
Yeah.
have that. And there's also something that I talk about in the book where I look at the names of the characters in the story of Yaakov and Esav and Rachel and Leah and their father Lavan. And I realized that the stories of the characters could also very easily be the story of a flock of sheep. So there's a sense here that the people who rely on shepherding are so closely intertwined with the animals they shepherd that their ways of living become completely intertwined,
Right.
right?
That's
And I
the
write, go ahead.
model in the beginning that was offering in the creation. It's not that we are created to be their masters, but to be their shepherd, to live among them. And one last thing before I will open the floor for questions and answers. A few years ago, I went through the whole Torah and every parasha, and I wanted to see what animals, and if there were animals in every parasha. There's animals in every parasha in the Bible, in the Torah. I didn't go through the whole Bible, but in every parasha in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, there is an animal.
That's actually how the book came about. So, like, I took this amazing trip to Nova Scotia where I'd never been and experienced, well, many aspects of nature and culture that I didn't even know existed. And when I came back, I was working as a congregational rabbi during that time, and I started doing a series of Divrei Torah about animals. and people were very, very patient and affirming of this particular focus.
Yeah.
So I think that is like a great thing for you to notice.
Yeah.
After
And
you speak, I want to say one more thing.
one question, personal question to you, actually, reading your book, you must be vegetarian.
I eat fish.
You
I do
eat
eat fish.
like, okay, yes, I do too. I pescatarian. Yeah, because your whole I of course connect to your philosophy of, at the end it's about living with and not eating the animals. And yeah, Rav Kook has a whole teaching about vegetarianism. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think vegetarianism is also balanced with questions about eating more locally. Right. Anyway,
Yeah.
I won't go into that just at this moment.
Right.
I just did want to say about animals as companions. There's this very bizarre moment early in the creation story, the second creation story in Bereshit chapter 2, where God notices that Adam is alone and thinks that Adam should have some companions. So God creates a bunch of animals. Right? It's like at this point, the way that story unfolds, it's like God is discovering how the world ought to be through the process of creating it. So, God isn't really clear yet on this concept of DNA, but God creates the animal companions, and Adam calls out to the animals, and like everything seems to be going great, but no one is the right mate. I just think that is a very funny
Mm.
little image of God figuring out how this created world works, but it's also a beautiful teaching about the importance of being companions with the animals in your environment.
Beautiful. Let's open the floor.
I'm curious about how the ravens saved you, or crows saved you on your hike. What did they actually do?
What they did was so like I did three stupid things. I was by myself. I was at a high altitude when I had not acclimated to it because I had just like flown in from from another city, and I went off trail. So I started to get altitude sickness, and I was kind of, my body was tingling and sort of seizing up. So these three ravens, they started circling overhead and calling. And I kind of got up out of my funk, and I stood up, and they moved a little bit off in one direction. I followed them. They moved a little bit off. I followed them. They led me back to the trail, and then they flew away.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Amazing. I have been observing the crows in my backyard, and I have so many connections with the things you've written about and the things you've said. And I've started writing about crows. And in the process, I read Ted Hugh's book of poems called Crow, where Crow, have you ever read that book? It's very hard to read. It has to be read very carefully because there's a great deal of negative stuff about darkness. But Crow is really God's partner in the book as a whole. And it's very interesting because my image of crows has really changed since I began observing them in my own yard. I mean, I see family life in a way that I didn't see it before. So that was one thing. I was really interested in your interpretation of that really difficult story, Nadab and Abihu. It was a little bit hard for me to follow. That's it. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you want to talk about that because it's maybe a little bit off the track, but it was really interesting to me.
I think it might be hard to follow because like I try to pack in so much information in a concise way. And I know I'm a really concise writer and probably too concise sometimes. But the story of Nadav and Avihu is one of the two stories in the book of Vayikra, which is mostly laws and teachings about one like vision of having an ideal society, right, with all the rituals that people need and the ways to treat one another and an economic system that is sustainable. It's not a perfectly ideal society. There's a number of things that I would change if it were my ideal society. Just veering off a moment, there's a death penalty, for example. There are verses that have been construed or misconstrued as anti-gay. There's an affirmation of lower wages for women at the end, but mostly it's an attempt to have an ideal society. And then thrown in two places, there are two little stories about how people don't follow the rules anyway and everything falls apart. So you have to be vigilant, right, in this ideal society. One of the stories is about the opening day at the Mishkan, this traveling wilderness tabernacle. And there's two young priests who are sons of Aharon, and they do something weird that is not part of the instructions that Moshe gave them. A fire comes out from the ark and consumes them. And there's no explanation. So over the years, commentators have tried to look at little bits of details in the text to figure out what they did wrong. Like there's the sentence, they did something that was not commanded. So did they introduce their own ritual? After the event, Aharon is told, look, you and your people cannot drink any alcohol before you serve in the Mishkan. Was it that Nadav and Avihu got so excited about party day and opening day at the Mishkan that they drank too much? And maybe that's what they did. There's something about how people should listen to Moshe teaching Torah. Did maybe Nadav and Avihu overstep their bounds and try to teach original teachings instead of listening to Moshe? Nobody knows. They just scour for cues. And so I also scoured for cues. But I looked for cues based on a question that always bothered me, which is there's so much emphasis in the Tanakh on bringing the animal offerings to the Mishkan. People could also bring vegetable offerings and grain, specifically grain offerings to the Mishkan. You don't have to bring an animal, right? An animal is a pretty expensive offering to bring. So you could bring a different kind of food, a grain. But sometimes they're so extravagant when you hear descriptions of holiday offerings or king ceremonial offerings. And they're so extravagant. They're so wasteful. It's true, most of them are eaten by someone, so it's not that kind of wasteful. But, could it really have been the case that everybody thought extravagant animal offerings were great all of the time? Wouldn't there have been people in the universe of the Tanakh who were opposed to them? I mean, we do have vegetarians, right? We have the original instruction at the beginning of creation that plants are given by God for people and animals to eat. And we also have the story of Daniel, who doesn't want to eat the non-kosher meat and says, look, my friends and I will be vegetarian. It'll be fine. And it turns out that they're the healthiest and the strongest of all the young aristocratic men being brought up in the court of the Babylonian king. So we've got traditions of vegetarianism. Surely there was someone who thought the extravagant offerings were a bad idea. Where can we find evidence of that? So I looked at the story of Nadav and Avihu, and I saw that another possible little clue in the
Interesting.
text is that after Nadav and Avihu die, Aharon does not want to eat his meat offering on that opening day. And he says to Moshe, on a day like today, you think God would have wanted me to eat this? And I, in the past, have always read that as, look, this is a day of mourning. This is a day of grief. My son's just died. I am not stepping up and representing the people by eating the offering. But I started to see it differently when the story continues and God tells Moshe, it's important to remind the priests that they have to eat the meat offerings, and this is how they do it. And then immediately after that, we get the kosher laws, reinforcing that, yes, there are some kinds of animals that we can eat, and this is what they are. So I put all those clues together into another possible interpretation, strongly supported by the text in exactly the way that all the other interpretations are supported, but more strongly because there's more evidence suggesting that perhaps Nadav and Avihu died because they did bring a strange offering, and that as they did not want to go down the road of all those extravagant meat offerings. That's it. It's not the only possible interpretation. You might not be convinced that that's the right interpretation, but it's as plausible as all the other interpretations. And it also speaks to my heart because I do believe that there had to have been people opposed to the offerings. And it is quite possible, and it's completely in the spirit of Vayikra, that rules would be laid down that we're going to do things this way, and that there are going to be a group of people who say, well, we don't.
For
So
me,
they-
it's a great example of reinterpretation of something that a very difficult story that I think everyone struggles with to some extent. And it's like a whole new look at it. And it's always bothered me terribly. So I was really interested when I read about it. Thank you.
Yeah. Did you find any midrashim that support that, or any interpretation?
No.
That's nice. Okay.
Now, just because I didn't find them in my own research doesn't mean they don't
They
exist,
of course.
but it's not your typical reading. But there's a lot of things in the book that are not your typical reading, right? When you become an animal, I don't want to say an animaniac because that was a cartoon show that we did not allow our children to watch when they were young because the animaniacs are disrespectful to adults on the show. But when you become an animaniac, then you just see different things popping out in the text.
And also, it goes along with Maimonides' interpretation that the future temple may not need animal sacrifice, because the idea of animal sacrifice really came to substitute for human sacrifice. So it's just a step in our spiritual development of the lamb lie with the sheep, the lion. That's really so it's your interpretation, but there are giants that think similarly. I mean, I could keep talking with you for hours about this. This is definitely my passion too, and this is when you sent the message on Ravnet that you just had this book published, I thought that would be a good opportunity to include you in our blessing of the animal. Before the Corona time, we had the blessings outside, but actually this wouldn't have been a good day in New York, or at least on the North Fork here, to have the blessing of the animals outside. So I'm glad we did it on Zoom. So I thank you very much